welcome to the Learning for Justice Summer Read-Along. Today, the webinar that we're going to be talking about is entitled The Power of Space, Where Young People Are Valued. It is the last of our Summer Read-Along series, and we're real excited that you have joined us today. I want to welcome everyone. I also want to welcome our guest panelists, each of whom have a direct connection to the articles that we are highlighting here today. Our panelists, I'm just going to mention them and their background very briefly, and they're going to talk a little bit more about their background in a minute. But we've got Dr. Dorothee Benz, who is a writer, organizer, and strategist in the social justice space. We have Ian Siljestrom, who is a former teacher who currently serves as the Safe Schools Director for Equality Florida. And we have Brandon Wolfe, who's a nationally recognized LGBTQ civil rights advocate and a survivor of the deadliest attack on LGBTQ people in this nation's history. My name is Beth Luttrell. I am a senior supervising attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center. I've been a civil rights attorney for the past 20 years, and I have been doing LGBTQ rights impact litigation for every minute of that time. And so I've been involved in some cases that have created precedent, both with respect to students' rights and LGBTQ rights across the country. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about the issues that we're here to talk about today. Students' rights and LGBTQ rights were the focus of my passion from the moment I got into this, and continue to be one of the main issues that I am working in and bringing legal action around. We'll work hard to wrap up the conversation with time at the end for questions. So bear in mind, we want to answer your questions if you have them, and we will try to get to all of them, but no promises. I'm sure there's a lot of folks who are going to be engaged in the conversation. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, not the chat. So if you'll look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see something that says Q&A. Put your questions in those. Also want to let everyone know that there is closed captioning available during the show, and that the show is being recorded, and that following the show, the recording will be available on the Learning for Justice website. The Learning for Justice tech support, who's graciously in the background helping us out, is going to share the link for the recording. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, I just want to give you the reason that we are presenting these read-alongs, and they are to provide a deeper understanding of the article content. We also want to provide explicit suggestions for implementing the information in the articles, and we want to build community with the broader Learning for Justice audience. The articles that form the foundation of this discussion today, there are two of them. One is called Dear Young Person, You Are Valued, and that's by Nikole Parker and Brandon Wolfe, one of our panelists. It's a question and answer article with two LGBTQ activists who are on the ground in Florida fighting back against a tsunami of regressive and anti-LGBTQ legislation and policies. The article gives historical context to governmental use of propaganda and disinformation to create an American narrative that excises LGBTQ people. Nikole and Brandon share their perspective in this article on harms created and perpetuated by the current assault on truth and inclusivity, and they offer suggestions on ways everyone can advocate for safer schools where all young people are valued. The other article that we're going to highlight today and talk about is A Refuge for LGBTQ plus Young People. It's authored by our panelist, Dr. Dorothee Benz, and it explains the critical space that student-run gender and sexuality alliance clubs fill, known as GSAs, and why, despite progress in acceptance and legal equality, they're more necessary now than ever. She also talks about in this article how they are protected. These clubs are protected by federal law and the ways in which LGBTQ people and their allies can support young people caught in the crosshairs of a right-wing agenda to ensure that GSAs flourish. Now, the reason we're highlighting these articles is because they explore and explain the consequences that far-right politics and policies are having on the lives of LGBTQ students, particularly those of color. They contextualize the justifications underlying these regressive policies with respect to previous efforts to marginalize, censor, and erase minority voices. And they highlight that LGBTQ plus students and their allies have legal protections, and they have the means to push back against these policies, providing a path toward the light of positivity through self-acceptance, strength and diversity, and the beauty in inclusivity. I want to encourage everyone to read these articles. And so this discussion we're going to have today is not meant to be a repetition of the articles or of the information in the articles, but a conversation that expands, augments, and emphasizes the really powerful points that are contained in these articles. And with that, I want to give the panelists each an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves and to give us a bit more information about your backgrounds and my measly description at the top of the webinar provided, and just tell us a little bit about your connection to the articles. I'm going to start in alphabetical order, starting with your last name, and start with you, Dr. Benz, who I have worked with in the past when I was at the civil rights organization Lambda Legal, and she's known professionally and affectionately as Benz. So Benz, is it okay if I slip up and just refer to you by that nickname?
Absolutely. All my friends call me Benz, so call me Benz.
Fantastic. Benz, if you would, let's start with you and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, first I want to say it's great to be here. It's great to be working with you again, Beth. And I love doing this stuff. What to say about me? I use she, her pronouns. I'm an overeducated white lesbian New Yorker with a Ph.D. in political science, and currently also a full-time student at Union Theological Seminary, pursuing a Master's of Divinity. I've been writing for Learning for Justice for 2 years, and I have to say this has been one of the greatest sources of joy and hope for me in the midst of a very grim world. And the reason for that is because I get to interview educators, young people, community activists, and these are people with like incredible vision, unapologetically radical politics, and an amazing sense of agency. And they remind me every day that people, ordinary people, can change the world. And that appeals to my core identity as an organizer, and it also dovetails with my scholarly expertise in social movements. So I think that's the relevant stuff to say about me.
Fantastic. Ian Siljestrom, if you would introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background and your connection to these articles.
Absolutely. Well, I want to echo just appreciation to be able to be on here today and share just some of the insights and some of the things that we're learning here in Florida. And so I come to you all via a previous teacher. I was 5th grade science in Duval County Public Schools. It's Jacksonville for those of you who are familiar with Florida. And after 3 years in the classroom, there was a variety of situations that would come up that there was struggles to find answers to, right? Either my administration didn't have answers, or, could try to turn to the district office and there wouldn't be answers. And it just really created a frustration in a profession that I love so much, right? My mom is a teacher. My brother's a teacher. I have 6 aunts that were all teachers. And so just knowing I had a higher calling to see what was possible in ensuring that this profession could, better support all students who stepped into our classrooms. That's what I wanted to do. And so stepping into this role 6 years ago looks very different from what it's been the last 2 years. And just the attacks that we've seen on our profession, the attacks that we've seen on teachers, how people now talk about public education is something that we've really shifted, and we want to be intentional in making sure that, for the future of all of us, right, we still are able to raise and educate students in a manner to ensure that they're resilient and ready to be successful in this world. And so I'm just really appreciative and excited to share what has some of this national rhetoric, what have some of these laws passed here in Florida, what has that meant in terms of the impact on the experiences of students. And hopefully, I see there's people from Pennsylvania, California, Connecticut, Wisconsin, all over the place. Hopefully this conversation is able to help you all understand what you could be doing in your communities to maybe prevent some of the same things that we're seeing right now.
So important. Brandon, you're up. Tell us a little bit about your background and your reason for being here, your connection to these Americans.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. And I'll just echo the sentiments from Ian and Benz. It is wonderful to be a part of this conversation. It's wonderful to have had the opportunity to write a piece alongside my colleague, Nikole. So thank you for the chance to do that. I tell people that I'm still consider myself fairly new to the world of advocacy. I've really only been doing this work for the last 5 to 7 years. I grew up in a little town outside of Portland, Oregon, a really rural spot where not a lot of people looked like me. And quite frankly, not a lot of people loved like me either. And I remember how isolating it felt as a young person to grow up in a world where I was convinced at times that I was the only person like myself on planet Earth, where I didn't see a lot of role models. I certainly didn't get a lot of support from the adults I needed most in my life. And so I packed 2 suitcases at one point and moved 3,000 miles from home to Orlando, Florida, where I'm beaming in from today, in search of that place to belong. And I really did find it. I found it in the community that exists here in Central Florida. I found it in chosen family. I found it certainly in safe spaces, one of those spaces being Pulse nightclub. And again, until 2016, I was just on that search for belonging. I was looking for a place where I could be unapologetically me, both queer and a Black man living in America, and be proud of those things without having to look over my shoulder or worry that someone might hurl a slur at me or worse. And then one fateful June night, I was at Pulse nightclub, my safe space, my neighborhood bar with my best friends, when the unthinkable happened. And 49 people were murdered when a man charged through the front doors filled with hate and opened fire. My best friends, Drew and Juan, my brothers, were among those killed that night. And so much changed in the wake of the tragedy. So much changed for me personally when I had everything that I'd worked so hard for ripped away, that sense of belonging and peace and safety. And so much changed about our community and our fight. I think it was a stark reminder that our work was far from over, that winning marriage equality didn't mean the end of the road in the fight for equality, but that hate and bigotry were very alive and well. And so over the last 7 years, I've begun to dive deeper into advocacy. I left my corporate career. I now am the press secretary for Equality Florida. I get to help make sure that anytime LGBTQ people in Florida are a topic of conversation, that our voices and stories are at the table. And I think that work is driven, our organization really is driven by this understanding that we have to do better for the next generation of LGBTQ young people. We have to create safer, more welcoming school environments. We have to pave the way for more inclusive policies. And so that's why I'm so excited about our conversation here today, because it's grounded in that understanding that young people need us right now, that students really need us right now, that they need organizations like ours, they need conversations like these ones. And day to day, I'm reminded just how different my life would have been if I'd had people like you having conversations like this in my backyard. And so again, I'm very grateful to be here and have this conversation today.
Yeah, what a great reminder, Brandon, of how far we've come, and yet the fight continues, and in some ways, it's even more vicious than ever. I left Lambda Legal. So I started my career as a civil rights attorney for the ACLU. I then went to Lambda Legal, which is nationally, I would describe as the gay CLU, right? Fighting for LGBTQ rights, up through marriage equality. So brought some of the marriage equality cases, and then joined SPLC about 5 years ago to continue to do LGBTQ rights work, but also to like sue Nazis and racists, thinking that, the LGBTQ rights and the marriage equality work had kind of reached a zenith, and I could sort of pass the baton. But wow, we're still in the midst of it. So that's a good reminder. Vince, let's start with you and the article that you wrote. So I thought that I knew, everything there was to know about GSAs. I brought some cases on behalf of students who were denied the right to start one, and know about the Equality Act. But I did not know that the GSAs were now called Gender and Sexuality Alliance Clubs. I'm old enough that they were referred to as gay straight alliances, but they're now Gender and Sexuality Alliance Clubs. But nonetheless, it sounds like they fulfill the same purpose. So let's just start with the basics. In case anyone hasn't read the article, what is a GSA, and why are they important for LGBTQ students and their allies in schools?
Thanks, Beth. The name change is interesting, right? Because GSAs have been around for about 2 or 3 decades. And the change from Gay and Straight Alliance to Gender and Sexuality Alliance really reflects a broadening of our self-understanding as LGBTQ people, right? And particularly the inclusion of visible trans folks and students in that mix. GSAs are non-curricular school clubs, like a chess club or the student newspaper. And much like these other kinds of clubs, they give students a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is one of the things that always improves academic performance, improves school attendance, and improves mental health. But much, much more, and much more importantly than these other clubs, GSAs provide a real safe haven for students, for LGBTQ kids. And that is because, as you probably all know, LGBTQ kids are subjected to a relentlessly hostile school environment. Physical, verbal abuse and harassment, discrimination by the school, by the district, everything that you can think of. And both the Trevor Project and GLSEN have documented this year in and year out. I mean, it's literally vast majorities of queer kids experience harassment and discrimination. And not surprisingly, they suffer academically, they suffer grave mental health deficits because of that, including suicidal ideation. They suffer missed schools. Kids are afraid to go to school, and they literally miss school because they are afraid to be there. Their sense of school belonging tanks completely. So that's the environment in which GSAs exist. And by every measure that's ever been taken, GSAs improve all of these factors. They help mental health, they help academically, they help graduation rates, they help school attendance, they help a sense of belonging. And the reason is, pretty straightforward, right? They give students a place of refuge, a place of understanding, a place to be with others like themselves without having to worry about the next slur or the next fist coming at them. Real safety. And that is quite literally often a lifeline for kids. As a practical matter, GSAs are student initiated and student led clubs, so that they vary from place to place in what they do. In some places, it's a bunch of kids getting together, play video games, and talk about music. In other places, it's kids saying, no, our school has a really toxic environment. We're going to organize. We're going to take on the district. So the actual activities of the club vary, depending on where they are and what those students want to do.
So that's really important information, and it certainly answers the question with respect to what role that GSAs play, particularly for LGBTQ students who go to that school. Is there any benefit to non-LGBTQ people? Does it have any impact on the school environment writ large for a GSA to exist at a school?
The one-word answer is yes. There's less data on on the benefits of GSAs beyond LGBTQ kids, but it's easy to extrapolate what that is. So first of all, there is data that shows that LGBTQ kids who aren't part of the GSA benefit just in the same way as those who are actually in the club. There is data that shows that there is decreased homophobic and transphobic speech in the school. There's decreased victimization. And those things, I would argue, and I think any sane adult would argue, benefit everyone. You know, it's simply better in a democratic society for kids to grow up in less bigoted and mean environments. I mean, I think that's a no-brainer. There isn't so much data on how other students are directly affected, but like I said, I think that's a no-brainer. And the positive developments in school climate, I think, may be particularly important for queer youth of color who are overwhelmed by intersecting sources of hostility right now. And that's more important now than ever, when so many states are basically gaslighting their entire education systems by censoring accurate teaching about the history of white supremacy and its foundational role in the United States. So particularly for multiply marginalized students, GSAs can really be a lifeline.
Yeah, I would imagine that, you know, even with GSAs, that students have varying degrees of self-acceptance, of, you know, fear, and ability to sort of be out and proud. And
Yeah.
so the existence of a GSA, even if they're sort of not in a position that they feel like they can go into the GSA, join as a member, it still seems like it would create an environment where they know there are others, they know they're welcome, they know they're valued.
Yeah, I mean, think of Brandon's experience in you know, rural Oregon. And if there had been a GSA in his middle school or his high school, how much, even if he were like, you know, unable to step foot in it, like you say, you know, how much more that would have made him not feel like the only person on the planet like that.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the early cases that created equal protection rights, you know, recognized that LGBTQ kids couldn't be harassed or bullied in school. I remember the plaintiff in that case talked about how he spent 80 to 85% of his time navigating how to get from one class to the other safely, which just sort of reflects how are you going to have space for learning if your environment is really just about survival. So talk a little bit about how a student, so on a campus in which there's not a GSA in existence, how does a student go about starting one, and what happens if the school refuses to recognize or allow the club to meet?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say, there's something you've already mentioned, Beth, which is that GSAs are protected by the Federal Equal Access Act. And what that means specifically is that schools must allow GSAs under the same rules and the same procedures that apply to any other non-curricular club. That is a federal right that has been litigated for over 2 decades, has been, as you know, Beth, relitigated when it needs to be relitigated. So that's the basis of the right. In terms of what it means in an individual school, that depends on the individual school, right? Whatever the procedures and rules and are for any extracurricular club, that's what applies. So that just, you know, students just need to know how to do a club and then do a GSA using those rules. Almost always there's a faculty sponsor that's a part of it. That's a standard part of a non-curricular club. So I just want to take this moment to shout out to teachers that one thing that you can do to help your queer students survive is to say yes if they ask you to be a GSA sponsor, and make yourself like a visible ally so that they know you're the person to ask to be the GSA sponsor. What happens when schools balk or say no? Well, they're breaking the law. They come up with a variety of excuses. Sometimes they say, oh, there's no faculty available, we're kind of tight, on staffing. They'll say, well, you can meet, but can you give it a different name, like something that's opaque? Sometimes they'll go the route of saying, okay, we're going to get rid of all clubs, right? Because that is a legal option. Although it turns out that most of the time they don't actually do that. They just say that they're doing that. And then importantly, in terms of the Equal Access Act, students also have the same right as any other club for things like communication. So like if the chess club can do a broadcast announcement over the PA, then so can the GSA. If the chess club can put up a notice on a bulletin board, so can the GSA. And if the administration says, oh, why don't you use this bulletin board over here down the hall where nobody ever goes? No, you get to use the same bulletin board. And as my comment about relitigating this has indicated, schools do still refuse to follow the law on this. And if that happens, you got to fight back. The law is on your side, and it is your right as a student to do that. Sometimes, you basically organize. That's the best way to win anything. My bias as an organizer, but if you need to, you call in the lawyers, right? Which is Southern Poverty Law Center, Lambda Legal, ACLU. And what usually ends up happening, and this is my experience from my time at Lambda, is the lawyers will send a letter to the school reminding them very politely what their obligations are. And most of the time the school relents because you know what? They know full well what the law says. So that's kind of the process.
Yeah. Power of the lawyer letter, very familiar. I wield it respectfully. Yeah, all of that is really important. I'll just add, just for administrators, that that foot dragging, the balking that you mentioned, Benz, it's really important for administrators who are allies to help students when that happens, to ensure that they have crossed their T's and dotted their I's and sent, have everything that's required and in writing, because that's exactly what we see on the ground, is that the administrators try to fool the young people into thinking that they need more things than they do, and then they can't prove it. So they need some adults to assist. Your article notes, Benz, that for the first time in 3 years that the number of GSAs have decreased, and that's after years of steadily increasing, right? Mm-hmm. So among the reason you mentioned, of course, the pandemic had its impact, but you mentioned political extremism and direct threats to LGBTQ people's rights. Can you talk a little bit more about how political extremism and direct threats to LGBTQ rights is having an impact on GSAs?
Yeah, sure. I think Ian's going to give us the on the ground version of that, being like really in the middle of the fire in Florida. But it is a much broader phenomenon, right? We are experiencing an extended moment. It is not a short moment of ferocious backlash, both against queer folks and against Black folks, and really against the idea of a diverse nation. And you mentioned a couple of points that we've had these notable legal victories, right? We have marriage equality, and as Brandon said, it's like, oh, we thought we were maybe there. No, we're not there, right? And we have workplace protections now too. The reality on the ground for students, for young LGBTQ people, has never been that good, right? They have always faced and it's really almost impossible to overstate how hostile school environments have always been for young people. But right now, on top of that hostility, are all these efforts on the state level, and then they trickle down to local levels and to school board levels to directly curtail how educators can educate and what students can do, right? So we have things like the Don't Say Gay law in Florida. We have things like denial of health care to trans minors. We have book bans galore going on. And these attacks, and again, I think Ian will provide a more direct perspective. A lot of them are very vague. They are deliberately vague because then educators are not sure what they can do, and and they get scared. That is the point of these kinds of things, and that takes its toll. Educators are scared, students are scared, parents are scared, and you do see that in some folks, not sure that they're willing to sponsor the GSA. They're not sure it'll cost them their job. So I think that is a direct effect of the political climate. And I want to say, it is very important to connect these attacks on queer youth and on what educators can do to provide a safe environment for their queer youth to the political attacks on, as I said, a diverse nation. Basically, the bans on teaching history are part and parcel of the effort to force us back into the closet. And I want to mention in that context, there was a news story last week about a parent in Texas, which is the other Florida, right? Complaining about a classroom poster where children of different colors were holding hands. And this parent alleged that their child was traumatized by this. So it fell under the law of you can't do anything that upsets people, right? And that to me is just, it's sort of saying the quiet part out loud, that these folks really do not want a nation in which Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and queer folks are visible, have rights, have power, have an equal stake in the nation, which to me points to this larger, I'll call it a Christian white nationalist project that really is driving a lot of this. And a lot of it is being driven far away from the localities where it plays out. Those of us who have a different vision, right, and who care about our kids' safety and their sanity, we need to organize. Right now, we are actually being out-organized by the right. We need parents and community folks to, connect with educators. We need parents and community folks to go to school board meetings, to know what their policies in their local schools are. Educators in many ways have their hands tied behind their backs, but they need to work within those constraints. They need to reach out to parents and community folks. They need to find ways, around whatever obstacles there are, to signal to their kids that they have safe haven with them. They need to protect their kids' rights. Kids do have the right to a safe school environment, and educators need to protect that. And that may feel like they're risking their jobs, but they need to do it. So organizing across community, parents, educators, and community together is what we really need to do.
And thanks for both making those important connections and also for the call to action. I think there are those of us who have thought that it's just too crazy to grab hold at what we hear in terms of kind of the ideology out of the far right feels like it's just going to pass over because it just seems nuts, like the example in Texas, and yet it's finding its way into people's lives in a pretty nefarious way. All right, so now I want to turn to Ian. Ian, time for you to come off mute and have a little conversation with me. And the questions I want to ask, I want to start with this, because you're on the ground in Florida. And that the last few years have seen an unprecedented legislative effort to pass laws limiting the rights of LGBTQ students and staff, right? So for those who aren't keeping up, can you just set the stage for us? Can you describe some of the laws and policies?
Absolutely. So a big thing in terms of our Safe and Healthy Schools department in the work that we do is we really try and come to one conclusion with our school districts, right? Have school districts take ownership over the needs of our LGBTQ plus youth and families, right? Simple as that. And so I think a lot of what Benz is talking about and a lot of what Benz was sharing is really connected back to classroom culture, right? And the school environment, because we know if a child is going to be able to learn, they got to be able to feel safe, right? They got to be able to sit in the classroom in front of a teacher and know that if they experience negative language, if they experience harassment, it's going to get addressed. And that negative language, that harassment is not going to come from the teacher themselves. And so, you know, if I rewound 6 years ago when I first joined into this department, you know, we get calls all the time. Probably weekly, we get calls from families asking for support. And in those probably first 4 years, for weekly calls, it was around negative experiences that a parent was expressing, right, for their child related to the adult in the building, right? So they were basically explaining, this is what the principal's done, this is what the teacher has done, and we're always working to address those situations. Fast forward, or really the moment we're in right now, we're still getting those calls. We're certainly getting them more frequently, but it's actually a lot of different calls. There are still all those calls that are coming from the adults in the building that are causing harm or harassment towards their child, but it's also coming from other students harassing that parent's child without any kind of recourse. And so what I think, you know, what's happening and what we are seeing, and there's also data that's pointing to this, is a lot of this legislation, a lot of this national rhetoric is having a really harmful effect on the experiences of our students and their families. And it's really ultimately empowering bullies. It's empowering folks to cause harm with very little recourse, right? And so when we talk about what's happening, it's really developed over 3 years. 3 separate legislative cycles, where at first we were seeing laws related to trans students and being able to participate in the sports affirming to their gender identity. Simultaneously, we were starting to see this language around the role a parent plays in the decisions that take place out of school. You know, the following year, we then started to see these impacts on classroom instruction, and we started to see language around bans on instruction related to sexual orientation and gender identity. We were seeing more around books, right? And then in year 3, this last legislative session, so this year, is when we then saw an expansion on that language. We saw more language around bathrooms, and we saw language around names and pronouns. It was named vagueness, right? And I want to be really clear on what that vagueness looks like in tangible examples. Because when you hear the sentence, and I ask people, right? When you hear the sentence, you are no longer allowed to provide instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity, K through 12. We ask, well, what do you mean by instruction? Because some people, they're saying, well, if you read a book, if you read And Tango Makes Three, true story about, you know, 2 male penguins hatching an egg at the zoo, is that instruction? And would I lose my license as a teacher? Or if I have that book simply in my classroom library, is that instruction? And I would lose my license as a teacher. I lose my livelihood. What if a student asks a question and they say, we're talking about families and I have 2 moms, that's still a family too, right? Can I answer that question? If I do, is someone going to say that's instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity? What about that sticker on my laptop, on my classroom door? Picture of my spouse, right? Can I be the GSA sponsor? We just heard all these amazing things that Ben shared as the impact on when a GSA is in a school. And that's what this vagueness causes, right? And there's a reason that the state didn't clarify, because we called plenty of calls. Please clarify, what do you mean by instruction? And of course we didn't get it. And so that's where it comes back to our mission, right? Okay, if the state, and you all might be seeing this in the states that you live, the same thing, vague language. if the state's not going to provide clarity, then we need our school districts to, right? When we talk about school districts taking ownership over the needs of our LGBTQ plus students and their families, we need them to be clear on what that means. Teachers shouldn't have these questions. They should know outright what are the things that they need to be doing and cognizant of to ensure that they can fulfill their mission, right? Which is making sure that they have highly successful students that are ready to graduate from high school. And so when we think of the impacts, right, what we're seeing on our students, I have heard more families now afraid to enroll their child in our schools than ever before. Absolutely, there's a fear of what activities students feel as though they can participate in. We're having school districts do things like take down every single rainbow sticker. We're having school districts do things like, oh, that picture of students marching around this legislation, and because they have a rainbow flag, let's put a big black sticker over it. We have to censor it. We cannot allow students to see a picture of their own peers in school with a rainbow flag. I mean, this is the extent in which it has gone. And we know the harms are on every single child. For every single person on here who's a teacher, and I can speak as someone who was a teacher, if I didn't address negative language in the classroom, that negative language, that fear amongst any student is going to perpetuate. Because even if it's not the child who's directly being addressed with a slur, of course there's 5 other students who are seeing it happen and they're scared. Well, that wasn't addressed. So I either have 2 choices as that child. I'm also going to pick on the child to try to protect myself, or I'm going to try to hide and not be the one targeted. That's not what our kids need to be experiencing, right? Our kids need to be able to be safe in that classroom so that they can learn, so that they can excel. And teachers, right? We are putting teachers amidst a teacher shortage, mind you, right? One of the worst teacher shortages we have ever seen in Florida, but we know it's happening across the country. In the same time as teacher shortages, teachers are put in this situation, right? If they're a trans teacher, that if they, no one knows they're trans, right? They have been themselves the last 20 years. No one knows they're trans. They're doing their thing. They just won Teacher of the Year last year, right? Now, based on these laws, they're having to make a really tough decision. Do I address my class as Mr. S if I was trans and now I've technically broken the law? Or do I out myself and have to tell teachers, all of who have always presumed me to be a cisgender male, now I have to tell them that that's not the case, right? Or bathrooms. If I'm having to decide what bathroom to step into, am I going to be doing something that people are going to say is breaking the law, or to use the bathroom at the same school I've taught at for 10 years? These are the impossible decisions that our teachers are having to make. And all of it is a distraction from what everyone claims to say is the ultimate goal, right? Creating school environments where our kids can succeed. And yet it's a lot of distractions. It's a lot of unnecessary harms that are happening at the expense of a lot of families, a lot of students, and a lot of teachers. And so that's where, when we come back to all of this, we feel as though the most critical thing that can be done is, if a state is not going to clarify those laws, then we have to ensure that our school districts do, to assuage some of those fears that people have, and make sure that they know when your child enrolls in our school, full stop, we're going to make sure that they're safe, because we know that's what's required to ensure they can learn.
The irony as you're talking, Ian, and giving the example of sort of putting a black sticker over students because they're holding a rainbow flag. Number one, what does it say to students that they're censored, that their existence is censored? And how is that not instruction on sexual orientation, albeit sort of a negative instruction? It's pretty rich. I'm going to jump to Brandon and make sure that we have time, and then we may circle back around, because I certainly have more questions for everyone. But turning to you, Brandon, I know we've set the stage with respect to the kind of political extremism. And I wanted to ask you about the connection that you see between adults who are sort of spewing anti-LGBTQ rhetoric or spreading myths and misinformation about the lives of LGBTQ people. I think of, whether it's Governor DeSantis or hate groups like Proud Boys or Moms for Liberty, or throwing the word groomer around and creating this horrible environment. Since most kids are sort of watching, I say this not having kids, but like presuming they're watching TikTok videos and worrying about homework, not politics and policies. Can you make the connection for us? Like how to hate and lie spoken on the floor of the legislature in the like school boards, how does that find its way into classrooms and school hallways?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you for tying those things together. Even in the age of TikTok and Instagram Reels, I'm going to sound cliche, and I apologize for that, but words matter. Rhetoric, language matters. And that language has consequences that are especially intense when the people using it are very powerful figures who have very large megaphones. And so the way that shows up is, you talked about the use of the word groomer. First of all, the painting of LGBTQ people as deviants or as a virus that must be contained in society, as contagious in some nature, that is not new. It is age-old, bigoted tropes that have long been used to rationalize discrimination and violence against the community. In fact, it was in the 1970s that Anita Bryant, who decided she wanted to go from supermodel selling orange juice to politician on a national level, she used that very same language to describe LGBTQ people as the core of her crusade across the country. She talked about protecting children from the LGBTQ scourge. And so we are here in this moment where we're hearing politicians and powerful people use that very same language. And when they do that, people pick it up around the country. The example you again used is the word groomer. Well, the groomer hysteria that exploded in 2022 is largely thanks to the office of Governor Ron DeSantis. The Don't Say Gay law was then a bill that was floundering in the halls of the legislature. Republicans, quite frankly, who were pushing it in the legislature were struggling with how to talk about the bill. They were struggling to talk about the language. They were struggling to defend and rationalize that language. And as a result, they went to the governor and said, we think this bill might fail. We think we might not be able to get it over the finish line. And that was simply unacceptable because the governor saw it as part of his broader agenda in terms of education. And so he sent his press secretary online and she trafficked in the groomer trope. She said, anybody who doesn't support Don't Say Gay is a groomer or is complicit in pedophilia. And that very same language began to appear all over. The Human Rights Campaign did a study immediately following that, and they saw uses of the word groomer in that context skyrocket 400% almost overnight. And then that very same language began showing up in the mouths of other right-wing influencers, people like Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro, and people on Fox News and other right-wing media outlets began regurgitating that same language of LGBTQ people simply by existing, posing a threat to children. And then that very same language began showing up on protest signs, started showing up outside Disneyland and Disney World, Proud Boys waving it outside of drag shows and brunches across the country. And then, of course, the result of that is it trickles into the conversations that are being had around dinner tables or in between people in communities. And so before you know it, one governor's, hitting of the nuclear button to tarnish the reputation of an entire community becomes political jargon that everyone's using around the country to describe a marginalized community. And so that's how it gets from the halls of the legislature to one person's political agenda now to the halls of school. And someone heard it around the dinner table, or they heard their families talking about it. They heard their community members talking about LGBTQ people in a particularly derogatory fashion. And we know that that weighs on young people. It was the Trevor Project that did a study that showed a majority of LGBTQ students, and something like 2/3 of transgender and non-binary students in particular, said that that kind of language, that political rhetoric, was having a detrimental impact on their mental health. So we know that it's getting to schools. We know that it's impacting young people. And that's because, again, hate to be cliche, words have consequences, and those consequences are intense when they're coming from very powerful people.
What about the argument that schools have zero tolerance for bullying, and so regardless of these new policies or whatever is going on at school meetings, everyone is safe and valued in your school? Like, do you agree that that's sufficient? If not, why not? Why aren't general anti-bullying laws effective in creating a safe environment?
Well, the data tells us that they're not effective because LGBTQ students are still far more likely to experience negative mental health outcomes. They're far more likely to experience bullying and discrimination at school. They are far more likely to experience sexual violence or other forms of violence in school hallways. And so for us, I think the answer is we've got to go where the data tells us, and that is that LGBTQ people are still at greater risk while they're at school. And that leads us to the question of why. And the truth is because schools need to name the community that they're trying to support. They need to, directly identify the students who need that support and do things that are specifically targeted to that community. I'll give you an example of why LGBTQ students, for instance, need a different kind of support. I am a Black man in America, which means that during my school years, I also experienced racism at the same time that I experienced homophobia. The difference is when you are someone experiencing racism, very often home is a safe space for you. You go home and there are people sitting around the dinner table who look like you, people with whom you can build solidarity and community. That is not always true, and very often not true for LGBTQ students, whereas home or church or somewhere else might be a safe haven for students experiencing other kinds of discrimination and violence. LGBTQ students may not have any other place to feel safe than school. You talk to a lot of LGBTQ young people, and they're going to tell you about the English teacher who put a rainbow safe space sticker up on the classroom window, and that was the only sign that they had somewhere in life to feel safe. You heard from Benz about the power of having GSAs in schools, and that's because perhaps that GSA, that club, is the only safe space for that young person. It's the same reason that LGBTQ young people are disproportionately represented among those young people who are experiencing homelessness. So that's why we have to target support systems and structures for LGBTQ young people. We can't just all students matter the situation away. We have to be honest about the population of young people who are most directly at risk, and we have to apply real solutions that are informed by their lived experiences.
Yeah, all super great and important points. So I'm going to turn now to a question from the audience, and I'm gonna direct this one to Ian. Ian, how do we combat the facts that a minority of people are winning, right? It's a minority of people who are sort of getting the discriminatory legislation and policies made into law. What can the majority who believe in acceptance and inclusivity and safe schools for everyone, what can they do? Yeah,
I think a big first piece is making sure that we counter and correct the narrative. Because you could ask anyone who is a teacher, and when conversations come up around parents, every single teacher will say the parent is like the most pivotal person to be able to do my job most effectively. When I think of starting the robotics club, I made sure that I was looped in with those parents because I needed to use them to make sure that the students wanted to come to the club, right? I needed the parents invested in that. When we talk about homework and making sure homework got accomplished, it was calling parents to say, hey, your child didn't complete homework today. When it was coming to celebrations and field days, inviting parents to be a part of that. we know as teachers, we know as educators that parents are pivotal to the success of the child. And yet, somehow, there has been able to be created this narrative as if teachers and schools are completely disconnected from parents. And so I think one of it is we have to be crystal clear and we have to give those examples where it's just not true, right? And I think the role that parents play in schools is one of those things that a lot of people speak very inaccurately about. The other thing I would say, I really believe, when we think about this, I meet with a lot of people in districts that would be more inclined to put affirming policies in place that are scared. And they think the only opportunity is to be, at a board meeting. And that's a critical piece. But I'm also telling them, hey, just emailing, just calling, just asking questions, right, to the people who are maybe your supervisor in your district office, or asking questions to your principal. That's the kind of pressure that helps to ensure that school districts take it seriously, that this is a concern for folks. Because if that's not happening, right, if teachers aren't asking clarity questions, if parents aren't, being a part of that process and coming to the first day of school and trying to understand how to, create this environment where their child's going to be able to thrive, if there's disengagement, that's what allows a smaller audience of people who are maybe more vocal to be able to do what they want to do, right? And a lot of this, unfortunately, is coming down to power, and it's coming down to politics. And I think that's part of the problem is a lot of us, Brandon alluded to, new in his advocacy journey, I never planned to do anything related to politics. I never planned to do anything related to advocacy. Most teachers never plan to do anything related to politics or advocacy. We join the profession. We spend 4 years of our college career and a lot of money to be able to create environments where kids can learn, because we probably had a teacher in our lives that changed our lives. And that's what we wanted to do, right? And so it's hard when our profession becomes so politicized for maybe people to realize that we maybe have to lean in more to save the profession. And I think that's probably what I would encourage people. If not do something at an elected official level, at least ask questions to ensure that your administration or your district office takes the concern seriously and tries to provide guidance to you all.
Very nice. Thanks. So great advice. Get involved, get engaged, get in the classrooms, get in the voting booths, and let your voice be heard. We've got to wrap it up. This has been an amazing conversation. Obviously, we needed more than an hour with this great group. I want to thank you all. But before we end, a few things I want to make announcements about. The first is to mention that Learning for Justice offers professional learning cohorts. And right now, the Teaching Hard History and Critical Practice for Social Justice applications are available online right now. And those applications are open until August 31st. For more information, visit our Learning for Justice Professional Development webpage, and tech support's going to drop that into the chat. Visit our Learning for Justice website to explore the many resources that are available. And again, there'll be a link in the chat. Don't forget to sign up to receive our Learning for Justice magazine. There's a link for that. And I want to really thank from the bottom of my heart, express the gratitude on behalf of SPLC, all of the panelists for providing your time and your expertise and your wisdom. I want to thank tech support, who are sort of wizards in the background making all of this happen. I also want to thank our American Sign Language interpreter, Dean Evans. Thank you so much for being here and for your assistance. And most of all, I want to thank all the participants. We're doing this for you. We're hopeful that it's been engaging and enlightening. It's really helpful to us if you would take a moment to fill out the evaluation. If you could complete that before exiting, and tech support will drop a link for that. We'd be super appreciative. Thank you for all that you do in your communities and for your students. And with that, I want to wish everyone a great rest of your day and evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye, everybody.